Cognitive Psychology, Concepts and Imagery, Chapter 9. Preview questions. What are concepts and what are they for? What advantages and disadvantages might there be to using concepts? Can you clearly define cake as against biscuit? Are some birds more bird-like than others? In what way is imagining a chair similar to seeking and using an actual chair? Thinking of one concept quickly leads to thinking of others that are very different from the starting one. How might this be useful? How might mental concepts be represented in a physical brain? Introduction. Although the world is full of unique objects and events, it is very useful to treat many distinct objects as if they were the same. So new cups, tables, and dogs are usually treated as if they are essentially the same as previously experienced cups, tables, and dogs. When we treat distinct objects as the same as other distinct objects, we are using concepts to represent all the distinct objects that make up the categories concerned. Thus, concepts are mental representations of broad classes or categories of things, actions, and relationships. Dealing in concepts rather than in distinct individual objects is clearly an efficient way to work and emerges as an inevitable result of how the brain responds to stimulation, in that similar stimuli evoke similar activation patterns and, by association, will arouse similar memories and action tendencies. So, if something that looks like a previously encountered tiger comes around the corner, this will activate thoughts of tigers and their properties, one of which is that they are dangerous to humans, and the action tendency to flee will become very strong very rapidly. Concepts allow us to organize information in long-term semantic memory very efficiently into hierarchical structures. Thus, if we have tiger linked to the higher order concept mammal, we do not need to explicitly store the fact that tigers suckle their offspring. If required, that can be deduced from the knowledge that all tigers are mammals and that mammals suckle their offspring. Overall, our long-term knowledge about the world is based on concepts and relations among concepts. Also, representations of current situations are in terms of concept. So, for example, faced with a problem of a car that will not start, we will draw on concepts of car batteries, ignition systems, and electrical leads to represent the situation and invoke rules such as if the car battery is flat, then the car will not start, to help us towards a solution. As we shall see, all higher-level mental activities such as problem-solving, reasoning, and decision-making, discussed in chapters 12, 13, and 14, involves imagining possible actions, choices, and inferences in terms of concepts. Clearly, then, the study of concept is a key area of cognitive psychology, essential to understanding how we represent knowledge, and consequently has attracted a great deal of research interest over the years. In the first main section of this chapter, we will discuss theories about what concepts are and how they are used. The second main section will deal with the fact that when people work with concepts of concrete things such as cats, cups, or cars, they often experience images of the objects. Such images are like pictures but are purely mental. Visual images convey information as to what an object looks like, and the image associated with a concept would seem likely to be important in using that concept. We will discuss whether images do play an important role, and if so, how. For example, do images help people to solve problems and make good decisions? Thus, the second main section of this chapter will discuss what we know about images and imagery. Theories of conceptual representation. Despite the pervasive role of concepts in cognition, there is no universal agreement on the best way to define concepts as a whole. It is more useful to think in terms of different types of concepts. In the following sections, we will consider a number of alternative approaches to concepts that have been put forward, and explore the extent to which any of these approaches can cover all the data, or if they apply to some but not all concepts. The approaches we will consider are those in terms of definitions, prototypes, exemplars, theory, essentialism, and grounded representations. Definitional approach. Think of armchairs and reading chairs and dining room chairs and kitchen chairs, chairs that pass into benches, chairs that cross the boundary and become settees, dentist chairs, thrones, opera stalls, seats of all sorts, those miraculous fungoid growths that cumber the floor of arts and crafts exhibitions, and you will perceive that a lax bundle in fact is this simple straightforward term. In cooperation with an intelligent joiner, I would undertake to defeat any definition of chair or chairishness that you gave me. Quote by A.G. Wells in 1908. Some concepts are well defined, and clear black and white definitions can be given. Well-defined concepts are the essence of formal subjects, such as mathematics, and are sought throughout the sciences. So, for example, a well-defined concept of an even number is of a number that is divisible by itself and by 2 without remainder. An odd number is simply any number that is not even. Some everyday concepts are similarly well defined, such as the concept of bachelor as an adult, unmarried male. Note that concepts are typically formed from combinations of features that are themselves concepts. So, in the bachelor case, the definition uses concepts of adult, male, and unmarried. Each of these requires its own definition, and within a given legal system, each would have its own clear criteria. So, to be adult, one would have to be above a certain age, currently 18 years old in the UK. To be unmarried, one would have to have not entered into a legally binding state of wedlock. To be classed as male is normally unproblematic, but even this feature or concept has difficult cases, such as intersex individuals, where a person has genital features characteristics of both sexes. Many, and perhaps most, everyday concepts are not so well defined and exhibit a degree of fuzziness. So, for example, as pointed out in the quote above from H.G. Wells, there is no agreed formal definition of a chair as against a stool, say, or of a cup as against a mug. The lack of clear definitions can have important real-life consequences. For example, a famous legal case in the UK hinged on the definition of cake versus biscuit. You can see some of the details of this and similar cases in box 9.1. Box 9.1, Practical Application, Cakes versus Biscuits. You might briefly consider what you feel are the defining features of cakes as against biscuits, or cookies if you're in the US. This is not an easy matter. A food manufacturer in the UK produced a product that was sold as Jaffa cakes from 1927 onwards. These were orange flavored, of a size typical of biscuits and covered in chocolate, but of a consistency typical of cakes, that is soft, rather than the consistency typical of biscuits, that is hard. Figure 9.1 shows a cross-section of a Jaffa cake. This product belatedly attracted the attention of the tax authorities in 1991 because chocolate-coated biscuits, but not chocolate-coated cakes, were liable to a purchase tax known as value-added tax, VAT, MOMS. The tax authorities argued that Jaffa cakes were instances of the concept biscuit, and being chocolate-coated should be taxed at 17.5%. The manufacturers fought the matter in court, asserting that Jaffa cakes were actually instances of the concept cake, and so should be liable for 0% tax. As a result of this dispute, many of the country's finest legal brains tussled over the issues. Was the so-called Jaffa cake an example of the concept cake or of the concept biscuit? The judge noted that the Jaffa cake had some features typical of a biscuit: size, placement in shops with biscuits, eaten like a biscuit, and features typical of cake: ingredients, texture, and sponge content. Eventually a ruling was reached that the product should indeed be classed as cake because of a key feature that, when it went stale, it became harder, as did Clear-Cut agreed example of cakes, while Clear-Cut agreed examples of biscuits went soft when stale. The Irish tax authorities in a similar case also agreed that the Jaffa cake was indeed a cake rather than a biscuit, largely on the ground that its moisture content was less than 12%. A recent case similar to that of the Jaffa cake has recently tackled the question of whether a health food brownie, the Poulsen raw chalk brownie, containing dates and brown rice, should be considered an example of the concept cake and so be exempt from VAT, or as an example of the concept confectionery and so be liable for VAT. The judge decided that although the brownies concerned were sweet enough to be possible items of confectionery, the ingredients, the manufacturing method, their taste and texture were all consistent with those of cake, and so, overall, these brownies were indeed cakes. Although clear-cut definitions of concepts are often desirable and can be found in formal subjects and sciences such as mathematics, it appears that most everyday concepts are not well defined. McCloskey and Glucksberg showed this for a range of everyday categories in a study in which people were asked to put items such as chair and bookends into everyday categories such as furniture or ornaments. Everyone put chair into the furniture category, but unusual items such as bookends caused considerable disagreement between participants and inconsistency within participants over time. If the furniture concept was well defined, such results would not be found because everyone would agree what was furniture and what was not, just as everyone would agree that 3 is an odd number and 4 is an even number. Although some important concepts are well defined and can be worked with using rules, most concepts that we work with in everyday life are not well defined. Accordingly, a major part of this area of study concerns alternative ways in which ill-defined concepts might be represented and used. This is the topic we will now go on to discuss. Prototype approaches. Consider, for example, the proceedings on what we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say, there must be something common or they would not be called games, but look and see where there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances, for the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., etc. Overlap and crisscross, in the same way. And I shall say games form a family. Quote by Wittgenstein, 1953. Introducing prototypes. One point that emerges from the Jaffa Cake saga is that everyday categories have members that vary markedly in how typical they are. The Jaffa Cake is not a typical cake, being biscuit-like in shape and size, but it's not a typical biscuit either, and so lies in a border area. If all concepts were purely definitional and well-defined, then all examples would be equally representative, and decisions about category membership would be clear-cut. So the number 7 and the number 13 are equally good examples of odd numbers. However, Roche and colleagues found that over many everyday categories, people reliably judge some examples as more typical of the category than others. So a robin is judged more typical of the bird category than is an emu. Both are agreed to be birds, and on a simple definitional view should thus be equally typical, but they are clearly not seen as equal typical by most people. A number of aspects of performance with concepts are affected by typicality. So, in sentence verification tasks, that is, judging whether a sentence is true or false, people were faster to respond true to a robin is a bird than to respond true to a chicken is a bird. In the study of semantic memory, as discussed in Chapter 7, an often used task is one of listing examples of category numbers. For example, list as many birds as you can. As you would expect, in such tasks, highly typical instances are produced more often than non-typical instances. People generally find it quite easy to make typicality judgments. The typicality rating task asks participants to rate on a 7-point scale how good an example is, for example, robin, of a given category, for example, bird. But a question arises of how are typicality judgments made. Roche and Mervis obtained evidence on this question by asking participants to list all the attributes of properties that they could for 20 examples of 6 different categories: furniture, fruit, vehicle, vegetable, weapons, and clothing. The example varied widely in rated typicality, for example, in the furniture category from the most typical chair to the least typical telephone. It was found that very few properties were shared by all instances of a given category, contrary to the definitional approach, but some rather properties were shared more or less widely among group members. Roche and Mervis proposed that the members of a category shared a family resemblance to one another and that members should be given scores for how much they resemble other members of the group. So if an item had, say, 3 attributes, and the first attribute was also found in 16 other members, the second in 10 other members, and the third in 2 other members, it was given a family resemblance score of 16 plus 10 plus 2, which equals 28. It was found that the family resemblance scores for the items in the 6 categories correlated very highly with the ratings of the items' typicalities on a 7-point scale. So, the more an item had a family resemblance to other items in a category, the more typical it was rated to be. From this, it could be argued that typicality judgments could be based on how closely the item resembled all other category members. For example, a robin has more shared features with other birds than does a penguin, and is regarded as a more typical bird than is a penguin. The item in a category that has the highest overall family resemblance to the other category members should said to be a prototype of that category. However, most prototype theories do not propose that the prototype needs to be an actual instance, but rather that the prototype is a statistically average member of the category. Just as the average family with 2.2 children does not actually exist, so also the prototype may not actually exist. In support of this idea, it has been found that people can form a prototype without experiencing it directly. Studies of category learning have presented participants with examples derived by modifying an unseen prototype, and after learning, participants correctly classified the prototype on its first presentation more quickly and reliably than other new instances. This has been found with a wide range of stimuli, from dot patterns by Posner and Kiel to written character descriptions by Reed and Friedman, and schematic faces by Reed. The mental prototype seems to build up as an average picture of the category members, even though the average is never actually experienced. Levels of categories and prototypes. Categories and concepts typically fall into hierarchies such as animal, dog, Pekingese, and so on. In a conceptual hierarchy, lower-level categories are nested within higher-level categories. When we deal with objects, there is thus often a choice of level of categorization. For example, if we have to name a picture of a particular saw as quickly as possible, will we tend to give a high-level superordinate category label, for example, tool, a low-level subordinate category label, cross-cutting handsaw, or an intermediate level label, such as saw. In practice, the mid-level concept seems to be most readily evoked and used. Roche et al. Argued that the mid-level is the fundamental one and called it the basic level of categorization. At this level, the members of the categories are highly similar to one another, but the category concepts are quite distinct. So, hammers and saws are distinct from each other, with few features in common, while types of saws are similar to one another, as are types of hammers. The superordinate category, tools, consists of exemplars that have little in common. Another way of thinking about basic levels is to say that a basic level categorization is most informative for communication processes. As Fodor commented, "It's a car. Tells you a lot about a vehicle. But that it's a sports car doesn't add a lot to what it's a car already told you." And we could add that saying it's a vehicle, or worse, it's an artifact, is not as informative as it's a car. Developmental studies of early language support the primacy of basic level concept in that early acquired and early used words are labeled for basic level concepts, dog rather than the superordinate animal, or the subordinate Alsatian. Clerking et al. Found that basic level categories were most frequently encountered by infants acquiring their first nouns. Evaluation. Although the prototype approach has been usefully applied to a range of conceptual tasks such as category exemplar generation and has led to fruitful theoretical ideas such as typicality, family resemblance, and basic level concepts, some limitations have been pointed out. First, can simple similarity to a prototype be the whole basics of categorization? It seems not. For example, a small dog such as a Pekingese may be more similar to a cat than to other much larger dogs due to its appearance, yet it is readily categorized as a dog. This type of finding is difficult for the prototype approach, which stresses similarity to prototypes as the sole basis of categorizations. If that were the case, we would have more difficulty with separating small dogs from cats than we do. Second, not all concepts have prototypes. For example, very abstract concepts such as rules, beliefs, and instincts were found by Hampton to lack prototypes. Third, the linkage between typicality and family resemblance scores seem to break down for goal-derived or ad hoc categories that are generated for specific goals. Examples of goal-derived categories would be things to rescue from a burning house, ways to escape from a hitman, and things to take to a picnic in the rain. Basalou found that the correlation of typicality and family resemblance score was near zero for members of goal-derived categories, but was over plus 0.7 for established common categories of the type used by Roche and colleagues. The items that make up goal-derived categories have little in the way of common features, although all, in their own way, contribute to the goal. A practical application of the notion of ad hoc or goal-derived categories to consumer behavior is given in box 9.2. Fourth, if a concept is represented only by a single prototype, then it is hard to account for people's knowledge of variability within the concept. For example, that coins of a set value do not vary in size, low variability, while pizzas vary greatly in size, high variability. This aspect of knowledge is dealt with better by exemplar theories, which will be discussed in the next section. Fifth, people bring to bear knowledge about likely relations between features and category membership. For example, in dealing with types of birds, seeing a single instance of a small blue bird on a tropical island being labeled as warm is enough to make people reliably judge subsequent small blue birds as warms. However, if a local heavily built tropical islander is labeled as a member of the Clautu tribe, we are unlikely to class the next heavily built islander we see as a Clautu. Knowledge about variability of features and their usefulness as cues affects judgments in ways not predicted by prototype approaches. Such knowledge allows rapid learning of some concepts, even from single examples, as in the case of the warren bird, which goes against the gradual build-up of prototypes over many examples. In addition, prior knowledge that some features go together, such as that small birds tend to sing and large birds tend to squawk, make it easier to learn concepts of new birds that match expectations, as opposed to those that do not. Knowledge-based approaches to concepts discussed in a later section address these issues, which are not dealt with by the prototype approach. Overall, prototype approaches have dealt well with some aspects of concept learning and the categorization of new examples, particularly when concrete concepts are involved. Limitations arise in dealing with abstract and ad hoc concepts, knowledge of concept boundaries, and of variability and relations among features. Problems with prototype approaches led to the development of exemplar and knowledge-based approaches, to which we now turn. Box 9.2, Practical Application, Goal-Derived Ad Hoc Categories and Consumer Goods. Ratneshwar et al. Apply the ideas of goal-derived or ad hoc categories to the concepts that people use to represent consumer goods. We might initially imagine that people would represent, say, nutritional goods as a hierarchy with food and drink at the top level. Drink might then be subdivided into alcoholic versus non-alcoholic, and non-alcoholic then subdivided further into natural versus artificial. Natural drinks could be further classified as water versus juice, and so on. Food can similarly be subdivided into lower and lower level categories. Ratnerschwar and colleagues emphasized a more top-down perspective and examined categories that consumers might construct ad hoc depending on current goals. Specifically, they investigated how different goals affected category representations and participants' similarity judgments of food products. The food products involved were granola bars, chocolate bars, fruit yogurt, frozen yogurt, ice cream, plain popcorn, an apple, an orange, a donut, a chicken sandwich, a turkey sandwich, and a cheese pizza. Participants rated the similarity of pairs of foods on a 10-point scale, either in a general context of things people might eat, or in a more specific context of things people might carry along to eat in their cars. In the general context of things people might eat, apples and donuts were rated as quite dissimilar to each other, with a mean rating of 1.72. But in the specific context of things that people might carry along to eat in their cars, apples and donuts seemed much more similar, with a mean rating of 6.2. In separate manipulation, participants were divided into those for whom healthy eating was a prominent personal goal and those for whom this goal was of low importance. In the general eating context, people with a strong healthy eating goal regarded granola bars and chocolate bars as quite dissimilar, with a mean similarity rating of 4.4, but those without a strong healthy eating goal regarded chocolate and granola bars as pretty similar, with a mean rating of 6.45. Presumably, people with a low healthy eating interest see both bars as acceptable snacks, while people with a strong healthy eating goal see granola bars as healthy food, which is how they are marketed, and chocolate bars as anything but healthy. Conversely, health-conscious eaters saw frozen yogurt and plain popcorn as more similar, with a mean rating of 4.6, than did non-health conscious eaters, with a mean similarity rating of only 2.7. Exemplar-based approaches. In view of the difficulties outlined above with prototype theory, other approaches have been explored. A popular theoretical alternative to the prototype approach can be found in the form of exemplar approaches, which we will now discuss. Exemplar theories assume that concepts are represented by stored examples alone. No prototype is assumed. How might this work? Suppose the task is to decide whether a new creature, a wug, is a bird or not. The wug's representation is compared with examples or instances of birds already stored in long-term memory. If the wug's similarity to previous birds is above a particular threshold, we decide it is also a bird. The wug would now be one of the examples available if the concept of bird is considered in future. Different specific exemplar models propose that all examples are stored and used, or that only selected, most typical examples are stored and used. Where typical examples are those that are highly similar to most other instances. For example, the robins as against the penguins in the bird category. Exemplar models were initially applied to data from experiments in which people learned artificial categories, such as categories of dot patterns or of schematic faces, while prototype models were mainly tested using natural pre-existing concepts and categories. Storms et al. Sought to compare exemplar and prototype approaches in 2 studies that took 4 different measures of categorization performance: category naming, exemplar generalization, typicality ratings, and speeded categorization, using natural categories. 8 everyday categories, fruit, vehicles, birds, and so on, were used, with 25 exemplars and 6 non-exemplars for each category. The exemplars and non-exemplars were scored for similarity to each other exemplar, instant similarity, and to prototypes for each category derived by Roche and Mervis' family resemblance method and by Hampton's method, in which prototype properties are directly listed by participants. It was found that instant similarity measures were better predictors of categorization performance than either Roche and Mervis' family resemblance or Hampton's similarity to prototype measure, thus supporting the exemplar approach. Evaluation. An advantage of the exemplar approach is that it readily represents variability within a category which prototypes do not. For example, Rips and Collins invited participants to decide if an unseen object was a ruler or a pizza, based only on the information that the object was 19 inches. Pizza was the overwhelming choice, even though prototypical rulers and pizzas are 12 inches. But pizzas are much more variable, and so instances of 19-inch pizzas could be retrieved, but instances of 19-inch rulers could not. Although there are data supporting the exemplar approach, outstanding problems remain, such as how to deal with hierarchical structuring of concepts, and how to incorporate the role of knowledge, and particularly the role of casual knowledge in forming categories. Shared causes are important for many concepts that cover very varied examples, such as concepts of drunken actions or of tropical diseases. The role of knowledge is considered explicitly in the theory and knowledge-based accounts that we will deal with in the next section. Theory knowledge-based approaches. Prototype and exemplar approaches are based on notions of similarity or feature sharing between instances or between instances and prototypes. However, not all categories exhibit much superficial similarity or feature sharing. Goal-driven or ad hoc categories, as we have seen, generally consist of very disparate objects. So the category of things you would rescue from a burning house might include babies, pets, money, jewelry, house deeds, insurance papers, all of which lack shared features and belong in a category only because they serve the purpose of the goal behind a category, which is to rescue things valuable to you. Other categories may also have very diverse appearances, for example the category of drunken actions or that of things you would keep in your backpack. In the case of drunken actions, Murphy and Medin argue that there is an underlying theory or knowledge that intoxication leads to unusual and reckless behavior because of the effects of alcohol on the brain, and this knowledge is important in classifying individuals as intoxicated from instances of their behavior, such as jumping into a swimming pool while fully clothed or throwing television sets out of hotel windows. A study carried out by Rips indicated that categorization can be driven by knowledge rather than by similarity. He told participants to think of a pizza and a 25-cent coin, a quarter, and to estimate the largest and smallest size these might be. Then they were told that a third object was larger than the largest estimated quarter size and smaller than the smallest estimated pizza size. 2 judgments were then asked for. First, was the new object more likely to be a pizza or a quarter? The answers favored it being a pizza. The second question was whether the new object was more similar to a quarter than to a pizza. This time the object was judged to be most similar to a quarter. In other words, category membership was assigned on grounds other than similarity, and was presumably based on knowledge of variability of pizzas versus quarters in size. Similar disassociations between categorization and similarity have also been found by Rips and Collins and Robertson et al. Such findings indicate that similarity to a prototype or to other instances is not the sole basis for deciding category membership. The role of casual knowledge in forming concepts was demonstrated in a study by Ahn et al. A category was presented such that its members tended to have blurred vision, headaches, and insomnia. Further, participants were told that blurred vision caused headaches and headaches caused insomnia. New items with missing pieces of information were presented, and the items that were missing blurred vision were far less likely to be judged members of the group than were items in which insomnia was missing, but the other features were present. Casual knowledge played a clear role in these judgments of category membership. Theories in the form of prior knowledge about a domain are also recruited in order to account for externally given categorizations, and one mechanism for this appears to be the process of subjects trying to form explanations for the observations. Williams and Lombroso presented participants with examples of 2 classes of imaginary robots labeled either indoor versus outdoor or Drents versus Glorps. Correct classifications would be made on the basis of either foot shape or antennae type. Participants were asked to try to explain the classification or not. It was found that the requirement to explain produced higher solutions in terms of foot shape, especially when the category label was meaningful, indoor versus outdoor, as foot shape was relevant to operating indoors or outdoors. Evaluation. On the theory-based view, concepts are thought to include information about their relations to one another and about the relations, particularly causal relations, among the features displayed by their examples. This approach helps deal with points that were difficult for the prototype view, such as the role of knowledge of variability and how features typically relate to one another. The theory-based view gives insights into how concepts can cover extremely varied examples, such as drunken behavior or healthy foods, on the basis of shared causation rather than shared surface features or characteristics. However, the approach leaves open the question of whether and how explanatory knowledge might affect judgments about similarity and typicality. Essentialism. As we have seen, most categories allow considerable variability among their members. So the basic level category dog includes examples from Pekingese to Great Danes. These vary markedly in appearance, but do they share some essence of dogness? An ability to crossbreed with each other might be a candidate essence, although it is not a simple feature. Many people seem to believe that objects do contain some essence, which may be hard to define, but makes them what they are, whether they are cats, dogs, or toasters. Essentialism can be seen as a special case of the theory approach and is the view that people tend to believe that category members share some essential properties and that, although appearances may be useful guides to category membership, it is the essential properties that are critical. A bird with its feathers removed is still seen as a bird. The essential properties may be seen as residing in the creature's DNA. In a developmental study, Gelman and Wellman found that young children of 4 to 5 years of age believed that the insides of objects were more critical or essential than the outsides. Children felt that dogs would cease to be dogs if their insides were removed, but would still be dogs if their outsides were removed. Barton and Komatsu argued that there are different types of concepts that may have different forms of essential properties. They distinguished 3 broad types of concepts, which can be labeled as nominal, natural kind, and artifact concepts. Nominal concepts have clear definitions. For example, triangles are 3-sided closed figures, and so fit the classic definitional approach. Natural kind concepts are those commonly identified as naturally occurring, such as cats, dogs, rainy days, and so on. Artifact concepts relate to designed and human-made objects that are generally defined in terms of their functions, such as television receivers, laptop computers, cars, and so on. Barton and Komatsu asked participants to consider different transformations of natural kind and artifact categories. 3 types of transformation were compared. These were functional transformations: a she-goat that did not produce milk, a television that did not show a picture. Physical feature transformations: a striped goat or a pencil that was not cylindrical. And molecular transformations: water not composed of H2O, or mirror not made of glass. It was found that natural kind concepts were most affected by molecular transformations, but artifact concepts were most sensitive to functional changes. This indicates that the essential properties of artifacts are their functions. It does not matter what materials the television set is made from, it remains a television as long as it functions as a television should. On the other hand, the essential properties of natural kind categories are their physical makeup, so a goat made out of silicon ceases to be a goat, even if it behaves like a goat. Box 9.3. When things go wrong. Category-specific deficits and pathologies. From a variety of studies, it seems that functional features or properties, what does the item do, are especially important in categorizing man-made objects, and perceptual features, what does the item look, sound, or smell like, are more important when categorizing living things. The difference in the basis of concepts about living and non-living things is reflected in results of brain damage, in that many people with brain damage show category-specific deficits. That is, they have difficulties with some categories of things, but not with others. An early study by Warrington and McCarthy examined a global aphasic patients known as VER, who had sustained a major left hemisphere infarction. Such patients are aphasic because they have partially or totally lost the ability to articulate themselves, either in written or spoken form as a result of an injury. They found that VER showed a selective preservation of knowledge about foods, animals, and flowers, and a selective impairment of knowledge about non-living objects. Later, Warrington and Chalice identified a case known as JBR, who was very poor at naming pictures of living things, 6% correct, as against non-living things, 90% correct. Thus, a double dissociation was identified, suggesting that the neural basis of knowledge about categories of living things is separable from the neural basis of knowledge about non-living objects. The same double dissociation showed up in a more recent study by Laws et al., who found category-specific deficits among a group of 55 individuals with schizophrenia, with some showing impairments in living thing categories and some in non-living thing categories. Warrington and Chalice proposed the sensory-functional distinction, meaning that for some categories perceptual features were critical and for others functional characteristics were critical. The most common pattern of deficit is for patients who have problems with living things but not with non-living things. Martin and Karamasa found this pattern to be 4 times more common than the reverse pattern of spared knowledge of living things and impaired knowledge of non-living things. Gainotti found that a common pattern was associated with temporal lobe damage and the less common pattern was associated with frontoparietal damage. Silveri et al. Also found supporting evidence for loss of knowledge of living versus man-made things associated with damage to the temporal lobes. Interestingly, some yet more specific dissociations have been reported of patients with category-specific impairments in their knowledge of fruit and vegetables, but preserved knowledge of animals and man-made objects. Further, specific brain damage in Alzheimer's patients has been associated with selective loss of knowledge of raw food and living things, occipital cortices, and with selective loss of knowledge as processed foods and non-living things, middle temporal gyrus, in a study by Vignando et al. As the occipital areas are involved in sensory information processing and the temporal areas are involved in processing functional properties, it was concluded that these results support the sensory functional distinction of Warrington and Chalice. On the essentialist view, experts in different domains, such as zoologists, botanists, chemists, identify the true essences of the concepts they deal with, and lay people tend to defer to expert judgments. So lay people accept that a platypus is a mammal, even if a highly untypical one, as that is the expert view. Malt gave participants objects that they were instructed were halfway between categories, such as a tree halfway between an oak and a maple, or a sea vessel halfway between a ship and a boat. The participants were given a choice between asking an expert, calling it whatever you want, and indicating that they could tell which it was if they thought long enough. If the pairs were natural categories, the expert option was strongly favored. But for artifacts, the preferences was strongly for calling it whichever one liked. Thus, people seem to be more essentialist regarding natural categories than for artifact categories. Further evidence counter to the purely essentialist view was reported by Malt. In this study it was found that although participants considered it essential that a liquid consists of H2O molecules to be water, their judgments of what counted as water were influenced by other factors. So, pond water was judged to be water, although its H2O content was judged to be around 79%. But tears were judged to be not water, although believed to contain 89% H2O. Thus, source, location, and function of a liquid also seem to play a role in making judgments of whether a liquid counted as water or not, as well as H2O content. In a related study, Tobia et al. Explored twin Earth thought experiments originally devised by philosopher Hilary Putnam in 1975, which asked participants to imagine that on another planet much like Earth, there is a liquid that has all the superficial properties of water: clear, drinkable, freezes into ice, boils into steam, etc., has entirely different deeper causal properties, as in a different essence, and is composed of new elements X, Y, Z rather than H2O. Participants reported that the new liquid was in a sense not water, but in another sense was water. It is proposed that people tend to have two distinct criteria for membership of natural categories, one based on deeper causal properties, essence, and one based on superficial observable properties. The general conclusion that both types of criteria are used in natural kind judgments was also supported by similar studies by Hokyosha et al. Grounded representations versus a model representations. The approaches to concepts discussed so far have not specified the degree to which concepts are purely abstract as opposed to involving sensory or motor processes. In typical information processing approaches to knowledge, it has been assumed that conceptual knowledge is represented by abstract symbols. And so the various models could be simulated in computer programs using abstract symbols to represent sensory and motor features such as red, graspable, or rough feeling. Recently, however, a number of theorists, of whom Lawrence Barsalou is the most prominent, have argued for a more embodied view of concepts as grounded in modality-specific systems for perception, as in vision or addition, action, as in movement proprioception, and introspection, as in mental states and effect, with no need for a modal abstract symbols. Barsalou stresses the role of simulation in cognition, where simulation is the reenactment of motor and introspective states acquired during experience of the world. So, when we interact with a chair, the brain takes on states representing what it looks like, the action of sitting on it, resulting feelings of relaxations, and so on. When we encounter a new chair, those states are reactivated to stimulate the previous experience. Imagery is an example of mental simulation that can play a role in problem solving. For example, given the task of finding new uses for a brick, participants often imagine a brick and seem to read off properties from the image that can then support different uses. Evidence for a role for bodily states in conceptual processing has come from a number of studies. Klatsky et al. Found that seeing an object such as a car key activates the appropriate hand shape, in this case a precision grasp for grasping and turning. Glambach and Kashak showed further evidence that object concepts activate arm movements. When participants were to indicate whether sentences were sensed by a pulling movement, they were faster to verify "open the drawer" than when a pushing movement was to indicate acceptability of the sentence. In a study by Witt et al., volunteers had to name tools or animals shown in pictures as fast as possible while squeezing a foam ball in one hand. Volunteers were slower and less accurate in naming tools when the tool's handle was on the same side as the squeezing hand that when the ball was in when the other hand, or when they were naming animal pictures. Squeezing the ball may have impaired tool naming by interfering with the motor stimulation of grasping the tool with that hand, suggesting that motor simulation may play a functional role in tool identification. Simulation also appears to play a role in the conceptual task of property verification. In this task, participants are given a word, say horse, and then a property word, which may or may not apply to the object, has mane or has horns, say. Solomon and Barsalou found that the larger the property mentioned, the slower the verification responses and the greater the number of errors. This mirrors findings from studies where the objects and properties were perceptually available, and supports the simulation view. In related studies, Solomon and Barsalou found a modality switching effect such that verifying loud for blender was faster after verifying rustling for leaves than after verifying tart for cranberries. Switching from one modality to another slows verification, and property sizes also affect verification. The abstract and model view of concepts would not predict these findings. Grounded theory also sees a role for simulation in consumer experience and choices. For example, the grounded concept of wine will contain information about sensory effects of wine, affective experiences, actions involving wine, resulting bodily states, and so on. Previous experiences and actions are simulated on presentations of wine stimuli and affect subsequent experience motivation and behavior. In a typical study in this area, it was found that presenting a picture of a bowl of yogurt with a spoon facing participants' dominant hands led to more spontaneous eating simulations and higher purchase intentions than when the spoon was not present. This result indicates that external cues facilitate related simulations, and the simulations incline participants to overt actions. Neuropsychosocial evidence has been invoked in favor of the grounded approach. For example, lesions to brain areas dealing with different modalities affect different types of conceptual knowledge. Damage to visual areas particularly increases likelihood of impaired performance with animal categories, which are presumed to be processed visually, and damage to motor areas particularly affects tool concept because motor processing is the main modality for such concepts. Neuroimaging evidence also indicates that when conceptual knowledge about objects is activated through object names being presented, brain areas that represent the object's properties in perception become active. So, processing artifacts stimulates motor areas while processing animals activates visual areas. Processing food terms causes activation of taste areas, and processing names of smelly items stimulates smell areas. In the property verification task, areas related to the properties being tested become active, including brain areas for shape, sound, action, and touch. Carota et al. Found that the cortical regions involved in mouth and face movements were activated by presentation of food words, and hand-related cortical areas were activated by tool words as would be expected from the actions related to the named objects. Further, they noted that tool words activated specifically the right cerebellum, while food words activated the left orbitofrontal and fusiform areas. Evaluation. Overall, a strong evidence base is emerging that supports the idea of embodied or grounded modality-specific aspects of conceptual representation. However, whether abstract concepts such as truth and justice can be wholly explained in terms of simulated or reenacted experience is highly controversial. Barzalou points to the widespread use of physical metaphors when dealing with abstract concepts as indicating a role for grounded representations in dealing with abstract concepts. So, happiness is associated with up and high, and sadness with down and low. Time is seen in Western culture as flowing from front to back, with us facing forwards, and so meetings that are brought forward are then closer than they had been in our typical spatial model of time. For more on physical metaphors and time concepts, see the discussion in Chapter 3. The area of abstract concept as a whole has hitherto been relatively little studied by either the traditional and modal approach or the grounded approach. However, a recent study by Harpaintner et al. Has addressed the issue. Using fMRI, this study compared brain activations to abstract concepts related to motor domains with activations to abstract concepts related to visual domains. For example, the concept fitness is motor-related and beauty is visually related. Responding to motor abstract words activated frontal and parietal areas, whereas visual abstract words activated temporo-occipital visual areas. This pattern of differential activation was similar to that observed between hand movements and object perception activity. Overall, the results suggested that similarly to concrete concepts, abstract concepts relating to action and vision are grounded in modality-specific brain systems, typically activated in actual perception and action. Box 9.4 Research Close-Up. Testing grounded theory of concepts using dual task methods in working memory for action words. Introduction. Language and action systems of the human brain are functionally intertwined. As predicted on the grounded theory of concepts, speaking about actions and understanding action-related speak activates the motor system of the human brain, and conversely, motor system activation has an influence on the comprehension of action words and sentences. Although earlier research had shown that motor systems become active when we understand language, a major question still remained as to whether these motor systems activations are necessary for processing action words. Shabani and Pulvermuller reported the following relevant study. Method. 15 monolingual native speakers of English took part in the experiment. The word stimuli used in the experiment consisted of 72 words, 36 arm-related action verbs, for example, clap, braid, grab, and 36 leg-related action verbs, such as step, kick, hop. There were 2 specific interference conditions in the experiment in which hand or foot motor movements were required. A control condition during which no movement had to be performed, rest, was added to provide information about verbal working memory performance without motor inference, and, in addition, an articulatory suppression condition was run. In each of the 4 conditions, control or rest, hand movement, foot movement, articulation, a fixation point was presented alone in the center of the screen for 3 seconds. The fixation point was then replaced with 4 words presented serially. The words in each trial were either all arm-related action words or all leg-related action words. Each word was presented for 100 milliseconds. Stimulus presentation was followed by a 6-second memory period during which subjects were required to retain the 4 words in memory in the order in which they were presented. After this delay, a beep prompted subjects to repeat the words they saw on screen. Results. The main result, directly addressing the key hypothesis motivating this study from a 2x2 analysis, word type X moving body part, revealed that when participants engaged in performing a rhythmic motor pattern with either their hands or feet, errors in memory performance increased, and a significant interaction effect was found, as shown in figure 9.3. Discussion. The rhythmic movements of either the hands or the feet led to a differential impairment of working memory for concordant arm and leg-related action words, with hand or arm movements predominantly impairing working memory for words used to speak about arm actions, and foot or leg movements primarily impairing leg-related word memory. The resulting crossover double association demonstrate that body part specific and meaning related processing resources in specific cortical motor systems are shared between overt movements and working memory for action related words, thus documenting a genuine motor locus of semantic meaning. It should be noted that this finding has recently been replicated in Montero-Mellis et al. Concepts connected, network models. Concepts are connected with one another to varying degrees, and this has long been a noted feature of conceptual knowledge. As the early associationist theorist Thomas Hobbes noted in around 1650, thoughts of concepts can quickly move, in a few associative steps, from a starting point such as war, to an apparently unrelated concept such as Roman penny, via intermediate association, as in war goes to treason, treason goes to betrayal, betrayal goes to Christ's betrayal, Christ's betrayal goes to 30 pieces of silver, goes to Roman pennies. In this way, apparently unrelated concepts can be brought together, and, as we shall see in chapter 12, this ability is useful for creative thinking. Collins and Loftus gave an early example of such a network, as shown in figure 9.4. Recently, attempts have been made to represent conceptual or semantic networks more precisely, using measures from the mathematical theory of networks, which can be applied very widely to all kinds of systems where nodes are connected by links, such as transport networks, social networks, and energy distribution systems, as well as conceptual knowledge. Schilling, Marupaka et al., and Kennett have found from word association and other data that the conceptual network displays small world properties. In small world networks, concepts are tightly linked into clusters, and there are sparse but sufficient links between clusters so that apparently unrelated concepts can be reached from one another by a small number of steps along network links. There is an analogy here with social networks and the finding that the average number of steps along connecting links of nodes between random individuals in a large society is quite small and usually numbers around 6 links. As a personal example of a small world effect, I know my previous boss, who knows my university president, who knows the UK Minister of Education, who knows the Prime Minister of the UK, who knows the President of the USA. Thus, I'm only 5 steps from Donald Trump. In a similar way, apparently unrelated concepts can be linked through a small number of intermediate links. Concepts in the brain, the hub and spoke model. How does the brain encode conceptual representations? A widely accepted view, which can be traced back to the pioneers of neuropsychology such as Wernicke, is that individual concepts are not highly localized as unitary representations in a specific brain region, but rather involve mass action of many modality-specific resources of information, each coded in different regions of the cortex. In addition to the widely distributed futural information, there are many grounds for proposing some central representation that connects up the many features that contribute to a single concept. Thus, it is proposed in the influential hub and spoke model that information about what a cat looks like, feels like, sounds like, etc. is integrated by a hub that connects the disparate features together. Studies of patients exhibiting semantic dementia, a progressive disorder exhibiting gradually increasing impairments of semantic memory, often exhibit lesions in the anterior temporal lobe. Such patients have been shown to have particular problems with atypical category members, such as deciding what emus are birds. Consistently with these observations, it is proposed in the hub and spoke model that conceptual hubs are located in the anterior temporal lobe. A supporting study by Pobrick et al. Found that application of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to the anterior temporal lobe in normal participants impaired performance on naming pictures of living things, objects that could be manipulated and objects that could not be manipulated. Thus, TMS had affected the hub area. The spokes in the model are the connections to feature information, and TMS applied to the inferior parietal lobule involved in processing action information, specifically affected naming only of the manipulable objects, but not of living things or non-manipulable objects. Overall, the hub and spoke model of how conceptual information is represented and structured in the brain fits well with much observed data from both normal participants and patients with semantic dementia. Imagery and concepts. When we think of a concept such as cat, most of us will experience a visual image of a cat, possibly augmented by auditory imagery of purring or meowing. Visual images convey information as to what an object looks like, and the image associated with a concept would seem likely to be important in using that concept. To what extent do such images convey useful information, and how do we use images? Imagery associated with concepts would be expected to be important on embodied views of knowledge representation, such as that put forward by Barsalou and introduced in an earlier section. Barsalou's simulation view of concept proposes that knowledge of concept is based on reenactment of previous experiences with category members, and so seeing the word chair would evoke reenactments of previous chair-related experiences, which would encompass visual experience and possibly motor and haptic touch experiences of sitting in chairs. These reenactments or simulations could normally be reported as imagery. Imagery partially replicates actual experience, but can usually be distinguished as being less vivid and more under the person's control than actual perceptual experiences. It should be noted that there are rare pathological conditions such as Charles Bonnet syndrome, in which people have extremely vivid but uncontrollable hallucinatory images that are visually indistinguishable from perceptions of the external world. For a review, see Cyrilli, Savgorodny, and Bisighini. Although imagery can be found in all sensory motor domains, most research on imagery has focused on visual imagery, as vision is, for most of us, the dominant perceptual channel, and so we will focus on visual imagery. Images may be regarded as representing the appearance of objects, and such knowledge of what members of common categories look like is an important part of our conceptual knowledge. We will now review findings on imagery, including the relationship between imaging and perceiving, scanning images, mental rotation, ambiguity in images, and neuroscience approaches to imagery. Imagery and visuospatial processing. Overlaps? We start with the question of the extent to which imagining an object uses the same processes as actually perceiving it. Regarding visual imagery, this is often discussed in the literature in terms of the degree to which imagery and visuospatial processing overlap. We all have the experience that closing our eyes helps when we try to imagine an object. This everyday observation is consistent with the idea that the same mental machinery is involved in seeing as in imagining. A number of experimental studies have reported interference between imagery tasks and simultaneous visuospatial processing, which supports the idea that imagery and perception draw on the same mental neural resources. This type of result was first reported by Brooks in a series of studies that have now become classics in the field back in 1968. Brooks asked participants to imagine a capital letter F and then had them imagine going round the letter clockwise from a starting corner and indicate whether each corner was at the extreme top or bottom of the letter. Going round the figure F, is each corner encountered at extreme top or bottom or neither? Beginning at the bottom left corner of the F, the answers should be yes, 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 no, 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 yes. Participants were asked to either say their responses or point to a Y or N on a sheet of paper with Ys and Ns in rows in an irregular pattern. It was found that making a spatial response, such as pointing, slowed down performance compared to a verbal response. The reverse pattern was found when the main task was verbal, that is, remembering a sentence such as "a bird in the hand is not in the bush," and indicating for each word whether it was a noun or not. These patterns of interference are consistent with a visual imagery task drawing on visuospatial resources. A similar conclusion can be drawn from Baddeley and Andrade's study of reported vividness of imagery when imagining was combined with a range of dual tasks. Participants were asked to imagine the appearance of various familiar objects while carrying out tapping in a pattern, visuospatial task, or counting aloud from 1 to 10 repeatedly, a verbal task. Participants were also asked to rate the vividness of their images on a 0 to 10 point scale, where 0 meant no image at all, and 10 meant image as clear and vivid as normal vision or hearing. For visual images, self-reported vividness of the images was reduced by a tapping task, but not by the counting task. When participants were given the task of generating auditory images of familiar sounds, such as the ringing of a telephone, reported vividness of auditory images was reduced by counting, but not by spatial tapping. In terms of the Baddeley and Hitch model of working memory, this result indicates that visual imagery uses the visuospatial sketchpad part of working memory, while auditory imagery involves the phonological loop component of working memory. In related study, Q and Person found that participants with more vivid mental imagery perform better in visual working memory tasks, but not in verbal working and memory tasks. Also, participants with vivid imagery were negatively affected during visual working memory storage by bright background luminance, but not during verbal working memory storage. Image scanning and comparing. Images are usually generated for a practical purpose. For example, you might have to move a large wardrobe out of a room. Will it be too wide to go through the door? Using imagery, you could try to compare the dimensions of the wardrobe with the height and width of the doorway to see whether the wardrobe could go through. Or you may have bought a complicated electrical item that needs several electrical outlets to plug into. Are there enough outlets in your bedroom? Using imagery, you might try to scan an image of your bedroom to find and count electrical outlets. A number of studies have examined such image scanning and comparing, focusing largely on the question of whether image scanning and comparing are like picture scanning and comparing. In a typical experiment, Koslin in 1973 asked participants to study pictures of objects such as a plane, a submarine, and a clock tower. The participants were then asked to form an image of one of the objects and to focus on one part, such as the left or the top of the object in the image. Next, they were asked to look for a particular part, such as the flag on the bell tower, and indicate when they found that part. Times to report finding the target part of the image varied in accordance with how far the target was from the starting point in the image. So parts of the pictures that were separated in space were also separated to a corresponding degree in the image. These results support the idea that images are like pictures in the mind. Similar results emerged from a map scanning study. Participants first studied a map of a fictitious island containing 7 landmark objects. The participants first studied the map, then imagined the map, and were asked to focus on one object, next to scan the map image to find a second named object. Time to report finding the second object showed a very strong linear correlation with r equal to 0.97, with the physical distance between the objects on the map. These results again support the view that images encode relative distances with some accuracy. Other studies have asked people to compare images. For example, Fink in 1989 asked participants which is larger, a pineapple or a coconut, and concluded that such comparisons were imagery-based. Moyer in 1973 found that such size questions were answered more rapidly the larger the difference between the objects in real life. Paivio in 1975 had also found the same pattern when real objects were presented. So people are quicker to agree that a whale is larger than a cat than that a cat is larger than a toaster, suggesting that the relevant images encode size in a picture like whale. The basic finding that difference judgments between symbolically presented items are made more easily for objects that are indeed widely different in reality is known as the symbolic distance effect. Again, the studies of image comparison tasks have been taken to support the view that images are picture-like representations that are examined by the mind's eye, just as pictures are processed through the brain's eye. Similar conclusions can be drawn from studies of our ability to carry out mental rotation of images of three-dimensional objects, as described in box 9.5. Box 9.5, Research Close-Up. Mental rotation. Introduction. In addition to being able to create, scan, and compare images, people can also transform images and in particular can undertake mental rotation. Is mentally rotating the representation of a three-dimensional object similar to physically rotating an actual object, in terms of time taken and accuracy with which it can be done? In a series of classic studies, Shepard and Metzler in 1971 investigated this issue. Method. Shepard and Metzler gave people pairs of pictures which were perspective drawings of three-dimensional objects. The pairs of drawings were either of the same object rotated in different ways, or one object was the mirror image of the other and so not identical. Participants had to say whether the two drawings were of the same object. Results. Times to make correct, same, and different judgments showed a very strong relationship with the angle of rotation between the two pictured objects, such that the more rotation needed to match, the longer the time taken to make a judgment. This results in an inverted U-shaped curve, plotting rotation angle against time taken, with a peak at 180 degrees where the distance to be rotated is at its maximum. Discussion. The results are consistent with the view that participants image one object and rotated the image until it either matched the other object or not. Other analysis indicated that participants would rotate either clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on which direction would yield a smaller angular separation. Advanced information on the object and the degree and direction of rotation given before the comparison stimulus was shown eliminated the angle size effect. This suggests that with advanced information, participants carried out the mental rotation before the comparison stimulus appeared. Overall, the results of the mental rotation studies indicated that visual images represented 3 dimensions and that mental rotation of 3-dimensional images was similar in many respects to physical rotation of objects. Later studies, as in Logi et al., showed different solving strategies in mental rotation tasks for participants varying in their vividness of imagery. People with relatively weak imagery perform more poorly on mental rotations, although drawing conclusions with similar speeds as those with strong imagery. Logi et al. Proposed a poorer strategy of trying to imagine oneself going around the object as against rotating the object being used by participants with weak imagery, as compared to participants with strong imagery abilities. Age differences were also found in strategies used by younger and older participants, especially with more complex objects. Younger participants adopted a piece-by-piece approach to rotating complex objects, but older participants tried rotating the whole object and were slower and more error-prone. Critical views of imagery research and theory. Despite the results on scanning, comparing, and rotating of images, which are consistent with the idea that images operate like pictures in the head, some researchers, particularly Pylyshin, have raised objections to that view, and we will now discuss these criticisms. Pylyshin in 1981 proposed that the image scanning results of Gilhooly et al. In 1978 could reflect participants' beliefs or tacit knowledge about what should happen in such tasks. Participants would tend to know that it takes longer to scan a longer distance and respond accordingly by inserting a pause as suits the distance involved. Pylyshin tested participants using island materials similar to Gilhooly et al. He replicated the original results when the scanning task was given. However, when participants were asked to say what direction was one landmark from another, north to west, directly south, the distance between the landmarks did not affect response time. So, if scanning was explicitly requested, participants produced scanning-like results. However, if the task does not explicitly request scanning, participants do not produce results consistent with image scanning. Further support for a possible role for task demand and experimenter effects came from a study by Intons-Peterson, in which experimenters were given different expectations about how image scanning experiments might work out. In a map scanning task based on Gilhooly et al., half the experimenters were told that scanning an image of the map would be faster than perceptually scanning the actual map, and half were told the reverse. The results obtained reflected the experimenters' expectations. When perceptual scanning was expected to be faster, it was significantly faster than imagery scanning by 230 milliseconds. When imagery was expected to be faster, the gap between imagery and perceptual conditions was reduced to a non-significant 41 milliseconds, and the imagery speed was increased by a significant 201 milliseconds over the condition with the opposite expectation. Presumably, the expectations were subtly picked up by participants from small unconscious cues given by the experimenters and affected how participants responded. Pilishin criticized the image as picture metaphor, also known as the depictive representation theory, on theoretical grounds. He pointed out that pictures can be arbitrarily damaged, for example, cut in half or torn up into small pieces, but images can be transformed only in terms of meaningful components being added or removed. Also, we can perceive pictures without advance warning of their contents, but images have to be intentionally constructed and are based on our knowledge of the objects being imaged. Thus, two people may form an image of the same chess position, but the expert player will see relationships of attack and defense in the image that the non-player or the beginner will not see, because the expert has the requisite underlying knowledge. Pearson et al. In 2015 have argued in favor of the depictive view, both from the earlier results on scanning and rotation, but also from studies supporting the similarity of effects of imagery and of weak external stimuli. For example, Winnower et al. In 2010 found that prolonged imaging of motion of a pattern in one direction produced an illusion of movement in the other direction when a real static version of the image pattern was presented. A motion after effect is found with external stimuli. Similarly, Lang and Sullivet found that the pupil of the eye adjusts to imaginary light. In their study, imagining a bright stimulus had a reliable and predictable effect on pupil constriction, just as real stimuli varying in brightness would have had during perception. Ambiguity of images. The well-known Necker cube and the duck-rabbit figure by Jastrow back in 1899 are good examples of ambiguous reversible figures that typically generate alternative and indeed alternating structures. In the Necker cube, perception alternates between a cube with the leading face to the right or left, and in the duck-rabbit, perception alternates between a duck facing one way and a rabbit facing the other. The Gestalt theory of perception proposed that ambiguous figures caused unstable representations that resolve themselves into alternating representations. If images are like percepts, then images of figures like the duck-rabbit should also be ambiguous and reversible. To investigate this possibility, Chambers and Reisberg in 1985 showed their participants a line-drawing version of the duck-rabbit figure for 5 seconds and told them to imagine it for a later drawing task. Participants all indicated either seeing it as a duck or as a rabbit, but not both. They were then shown other ambiguous figures and how these reversed as one changes one's focus of attention. Participants were next asked to imagine the duck-rabbit figure and seek alternative interpretations of their image. Finally, they drew the duck-rabbit figure and reported their impressions of the drawing. It was found that although participants could easily reinterpret their drawings, that is, come to see a rabbit they had drawn turning into a duck and vice versa, they could not reverse the mental image of either a duck into a rabbit or a rabbit into a duck that they had constructed at the beginning of the experiment. This supports the view that images are not exactly like pictures, but rather always have some fixed interpretation on which they are based. Similar findings were also reported later by Chambers and Reisberg in 1992. In this second study, participants were told the duck-rabbit figure was either a duck or a rabbit and then imaged the figure. On being tested with comparison figures that differed minutely from the original, participants who were told the figure was a duck were more sensitive to differences in the bill or ears part of the picture than to changes in the nose or back of duck head. The reverse pattern held for those participants who had been told the picture was of a rabbit. Chambers and Reisberg argued that in interpreting a picture and informing an image of a creature, people attend mainly to the face, and for the duck interpretation, the face is to the left, and for the rabbit, the face is to the right. Similar results showing difficulty in reinterpreting images have also been reported by Pischlin. However, in some circumstances, when plentiful hints and cues were provided, Mast and Koslin did find image reversal with a stimulus that looked like a young woman in one orientation and an old woman if rotated 90 degrees. It seems then that image reversal is something plausible, but generally very difficult. Neuropsychology and neuroscience of imagery. If imagery is a reenactment of perception, then it would be expected that brain areas known to be involved in perception would also be involved in imagery. A number of studies have examined this issue. Roland and Friberg in 1985 found large activation effects in the occipital lobe, which is heavily involved in visual perception, as indexed by blood flow measures when participants carried out visual imagery tasks as compared with tasks of similar difficulty levels that did not involve visual imagery, such as mental arithmetic. Farah et al. In 1988 found similar results for visual imaging with a range of neuroscience measures including event-related potentials. Sator et al. In 1996 found similar effects with auditory imagery. Forming and using auditory images of songs had an activating effect in the secondary auditory cortex, which was similar to but weaker than the activation obtained when listening to the songs. In related study, Koslin et al. In 1995 had participants form images of varying size and not only found increased occipital activation, but also that the specific occipital area activated depended on the size of the image being formed. Ganis et al. In 2004 compared fMRI results when people imaged figures and actually perceived the figures. This fine-grained comparison indicated that although similar brain areas were involved in the imagery and perceptual versions of the tasks, the areas most activated in imagery, occipital and temporal regions, were a reduced set of those activated during perception. This is consistent with the fact that people rarely confuse images with percepts, except in certain pathologies. Box 9.6 When Things Go Wrong. Spontaneous vivid imagery. Charles Bonnet syndrome. Being able to generate appropriate mental images when remembering or problem solving is a useful ability. However, in some clinical conditions, very vivid spontaneous images can occur uncontrollably that are as detailed as real perceptions, but frequently rather bizarre. The first attempt to study and record such hallucinatory imagery began in 1760, when a Swiss naturalist, Charles Bonnet, became concerned when his grandfather, Charles Lullin, who had severe cataracts, began to experience amusing and magical visions. The 89-year-old Lullin had visions of people, birds, carriages, and buildings, all of which were invisible to everyone but him. These vivid images appeared spontaneously and were superimposed upon such vision as he still had. Bonnet recorded his grandfather's reports and the condition he described as now known as Charles Bonnet syndrome. People with this syndrome see non-existent patterns such as brickwork or tiles, or phantom objects in great detail, including people, animals, and buildings. The images are very vivid and often fit in with the surroundings. For example, a non-existent man in full Highland dress might be seen in the sufferer's favorite armchair. These images last for a variable range of times, from seconds to hours. The hallucinations are purely visual and are not accompanied by imagery, sounds, or smells. Floating disembodied faces are often reported that appear at random times. These faces often have wide, unblinking eyes and prominent teeth, rather like gargoyles. The visions are sometimes life-size, but often the hallucinations appear in miniature, an effect called Lilliput hallucinations, after the small Lilliputian people from Gulliver's Travels. Charles Bonnet syndrome is most common in people at the early stages of sight loss, and the hallucinations usually begin while their vision is still present but slowly diminishing. The most common factor is macular degeneration, where cells in the retina malfunction and cause a slowly spreading blind spot in the center of vision. Glaucoma and cataracts can also cause symptoms. The prevalence of Charles Bonnet syndrome is difficult to assess, as patients are often reluctant to seek medical attention for fear of being labeled as psychiatric cases. However, incidence in visually impaired patients has been estimated as ranging from 10 to 38%. The cause of Charles Bonnet syndrome is not definitely known, but it seems likely that the brain is attempting to compensate for a shortage of visual stimuli. Because the visual system is active without constraining retinal inputs, the syndrome is also sometimes referred to as visual release syndrome. Plummer et al. In 2007 and Sandhaus et al. In 2000 suggest a specific mechanism. The most plausible hypothesis, they argue, is that neurons in the visual pathway going from the retina to the cortex become hyperexcitable due to the loss of light receptors. It is as if the pattern recognition regions of the cortex are trying to interpret the reduced light patterns that are coming into the eye and are trying out hypotheses to explain the noisy input. The end result is a sequence of cortical guesses based on the degraded stream of incoming visual information. These guesses are experienced as vivid hallucinations, for example, of little men in top hats and tails dancing on the kitchen table. In terms of treatment, improving the patient's vision with spectacles, improved lighting or other visual aids, and with cataract surgery has been found to reduce Charles Bonnet hallucinations. Overall, a large number of early studies reviewed by Coslin and Thompson in 2003 have typically found involvement of the early visual cortex in imagery tasks, especially when finely detailed images and tasks involving object shape as against motion are involved. Lee et al. In 2012 further examined differences and similarities in brain activation patterns in imagery and perception. In this study, 11 participants were shown pictures of 10 familiar objects: bag, car, chair, clock, jet, lamp, necklace, pen, umbrella, and violin, and an auditory input of the object name, or were asked to form visual images of the objects given the spoken name. On the basis of fMRI recordings, it emerged that visual perception led to relatively greater activation in the early visual cortex than in the later visual cortex. But that pattern was reversed when participants were imaging. The results indicated that while imagery and perception have similar neural bases, they involve different network dynamics, probably resulting from the removal of bottom-up input during imagery. Similar conclusions emerged from a recent extensive literature review by Dijkstra et al. In 2019, who argued that while both imagery and perception share high-level processing, the early bottom-up processing characterizing perception is absent during imagery. Despite the wealth of neuroscience evidence that imagery and perception share brain mechanism as reenactment theory proposes, some neuropsychological studies have found cases of brain-damaged individuals who have intact visual perception but imagery impairments and others who have intact imagery with visual perceptual deficits. These cases of double dissociation support the view that although brain areas for perception and imagery overlap, they are not identical. Evaluation. Processing of images seems to involve the same mental and neural resources as processing the objects represented. Brooks showed this in visual image processing, and similar results have been found with auditory images. Scanning and comparing images shows temporal characteristics similar to scanning and comparing objects. Similarly, mental rotation of images to compare images for identity shows similar characteristics to actual object rotation. An area in which images show clear differences lies in the detection of ambiguity in images. This is relatively easy with real pictures, such as a duck rabbit, but much harder and rarely possible with images. Finally, we note that neuropsychology and neuroscience studies tend to support the view that visual imagery involves a subset of the brain regions active in visual perception. These results are difficult to explain in terms of demand characteristics and implicit knowledge. Summary. This chapter has concerned two important aspects of mental representation. First, how do we represent general ideas or concepts? And second, how do we represent information about sensory characteristics of objects in imagery? We need concepts to deal with members of the same class or category as if they were identical. Although all cats are unique, and even the same cat on two different occasions has changed even if slightly, it is not economical or of mental resources to treat each unique object as if it were completely novel. Hence, we have developed everyday concepts of cats, dogs, tables, chairs, and many other things. The definitional theory is that concepts are represented by clear-cut rules stating necessary and sufficient features for an item to belong to the concept. Formal or nominal concepts fit this view, so triangles are three-sided, two-dimensional closed figures, or bachelors are never-married adult males. However, few everyday concepts are so readily defined, it is not easy to provide hard and fast rules to decide what is a chair as against a stool, say, or what is a cake versus a biscuit. An alternative to the definitional approach is that concepts are defined by resemblance to a prototypical member of the category. So, a blackbird may be seen as the prototypical bird, and the new possible bird objects are compared with the prototype, and those sufficiently similar to the prototype are accepted as birds. This prototype view is associated with Roche and her colleagues, who have reported studies showing that typicality is a good predictor of many concept processing tasks, such as making a membership judgments and attribute listing. Some difficulties with this view are that similarity can be a poor guide to category judgments. For example, a small dog may resemble a cat more than a typical dog, but still be readily categorized as a dog. Not all concepts, particularly abstract concepts, have prototypes, and goal-derived categories, for example, things to take from a burning house, do not show the link between typicality and degree of resemblance to other items in the category. Exemplar approaches propose that concepts are represented by stored instances without any one prototype. Exemplar models have generally been tested by having participants learn new artificial categories, such as dot patterns, and have shown good fits to such data. It has also been shown that exemplar models can be applied to natural everyday categories. Difficulties for this approach include dealing with hierarchical structuring of concepts and explaining the role of knowledge in using concepts. Knowledge-based approaches and essentialist approaches focus on relevance of prior beliefs about why categories have their characteristics. For example, the category of drunken behaviors includes reckless behaviors in pursuit of immediate goals, ignoring important distant goals. The category makes sense through some understanding of the effects of alcohol on the brain's frontal lobes, which are involved in inhibition. Existentialism argues that people tend to assume there is a hidden essence that scientists may uncover that makes, for example, a cat, or water, water. Children do show strong beliefs that the insides of animals are what make them the animals they are. However, source, location, and function of liquids seem to influence judgments of whether a liquid was water more than did percentage of H2O, the essence of water. The grounded or embodied approach to concepts, associated with Barsalou and colleagues, proposes that when we think of a chair, previous experiences with chairs are reenacted or simulated and guide suitable naming and using actions. In line with this approach, seeing tools have been shown to activate appropriate anticipatory finger and hand movements. Neuropsychological and neuroscience studies also report conceptual processing involving the same brain regions as processing the objects themselves. For example, thinking of smelly objects activates olfactory regions. How this approach can deal with abstract concept is less clear, although studies have indicated frequent use of physical metaphors in dealing with abstract concepts, such as regarding time as flowing from one's front to one's back. Concepts interrelate to one another via associated links and can be seen as forming a vast network. Studies indicate that the conceptual network has a small world properties in that apparently unrelated concepts can be connected in a few associated steps. In terms of the neural basis of conceptual knowledge, a widely accepted current approach is the hub and spoke model. This approach is consistent with the embodied approach of Barcelou, but adds the idea of conceptual hubs to tie together the sensory motor features of concepts that will be widely distributed across the cortex. The hubs appear to be located in the anterior temporal lobes, which tend to show marked lesioning in cases of semantic dementia. Overall, the hub and spoke model of how conceptual information is represented and structured in the brain fits well with much observed data from both normal participants and patients with semantic dementia. In regard to imagery, scanning, rotating, and comparing images show temporal characteristics similar to scanning and comparing objects, which supports interpretations of images as pictures in the head. However, implicit knowledge and effects of demand characteristics might also be involved in producing such results. An area in which images show clear differences from picture lies in the detection of ambiguity in images. This is found to be easy with real pictures such as the duck rabbit, but much harder with images. Overall, neuropsychology and neuroscience studies indicate that visual imagery involves a subset of brain regions active in visual perception.